by giving a little bit of background on who I am, quick chat on who Eol Science is, and then we'll get into the interesting bit of the presentation. So, I manage the scientific division of Eol Science. Before joining the company about 3.5 years ago, I was science director at a company called CSI Drug and Alcohol Testing. My background is in forensic toxicology and analysis primarily. And for CSI, I worked as a lead GC technical specialist at a company called Phenomenex. And before that, before I did my PhD, I was a toxicology laboratory analyst at the Irish State Laboratory. Eol Science is comprised of analytical, flavor, and production laboratories. So we're dedicated to manufacturing, analyzing, and flavor developing within the eLiquid market. So the important thing that we focus on is eLiquid quality and trying to improve the quality of eLiquid. We have a very technical team comprised of a large number of chemists who have a variety of skills in different disciplines, so from organic chemists to analytical chemists to toxicologists. We've also invested heavily into our laboratory, so we have amazing kit and GCMSs, HPLCs, everything you can think of, and we certainly would invite anyone who's interested to come down and have a visit. So eLiquid manufacture itself is very simple. You add flavor concentrate or food flavors with propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, and then you add nicotine. Traditionally, manufacturers have thought of this as being their recipe. However, with the introduction of the Tobacco Products Directive, the industry's really discovered, so to speak, that each of those flavor concentrates actually has tens to hundreds of different chemicals that make them up. So this is a GCMS chromatogram of an mandarin flavor, so an eLiquid flavor, and you can see that each of those peaks is actually an individual ingredient that's been identified. If we zoom in to the area that's highlighted by the green little box, you kind of get an idea of just how complicated and complex that chromatogram actually is. And I think with this particular one, there were over 50 terpenes in that flavor, never mind any of the other ingredients. So diacetyl and acetylpropanol are obviously very well known within the industry, and the health implications of their inclusion in e-liquids is very well known. So they're generally found in creamy, buttery flavors, all the kind of stuff that I'd like, as well as in some fruits as well, and they can lead to a disease called bronchiolitis obliterans. The MHRA have these two chemicals on their banned list in the UK, which is very much the correct response. But as a chemist, the first question, well, two questions that I'd have is, above what concentration? Well, the first question is definitely above what concentration threshold, and the reason for that is that analytical identification of the presence or lack thereof of a compound is completely limited by the limit of detection of an actual analytical method or the limit of quantification of that method. So to put this simply, if I get my chemist to create a fantastic method that's really sensitive, it can look right at the very bottom scale for ingredients that are in the method or in the actual e-liquid itself, that's amazing. We can get a lot of compounds caught, so to speak, then. If a different company or a different laboratory has a less sensitive analytical method, whatever their limit of detection might be, or wherever their limit of detection might be, they can actually get very different results to what we can get. So in the example there, you can see that even though they would successfully report the presence of diketones above 1,000 ppm, they've actually missed all of the other lower concentration compounds that were in there. And we've actually seen this quite a lot, definitely in the industry, especially with the food flavorings. So when you think of concentrates, and a lot of DX concentrates came out a number of years ago, the initial ones all reported that they were diketone-free, but on analysis, they were diketone-free to about 1,000 ppm, which is what the food industry was looking at, and not actually below that. That does seem to be changing now, which is definitely a good thing. So Paracelsus is the father of toxicology, and he said that everything's a poison, there's poison in everything, only the dose makes a thing, not a poison. And this is true for everything, including the diketones. And really you can
think of it in terms of recommended daily allowances. So for example, with salt, it's not recommended for an adult to have more than 6 grams of salt a day. So I'm quickly going to explain what health criteria values are, or HCVs. So eLiquid has commissioned about £500,000 worth of work on this with Vape toxicology advice and consulting. So HCVs are concentration levels below which an ingredient is considered safe. So if an ingredient is above the health criteria value, there is a chance that that ingredient can start to have detrimental health effects on the user. They're established by reviewing evidence from occupational and epidemiological studies, from laboratory animal studies, and through an understanding and consideration of a chemical's ADME mechanism or mode of action. So based on the recommended exposure level, an intake of about 60 micrograms per day, which is about 3 micrograms per meter cubed for continuous exposure of an adult inhaling 20 meters cubed of air a day, is considered an appropriate threshold for diacetyl. So again, just to point out, this corresponds to continuous exposure, whereas the exposure profile to diacetyl of an adult who is vaping is obviously going to be very different to that, because it'll entail a series of peaks followed by periods of non-use where they're exposed to really negligible background exposure. Existing studies on smoking or vaping patterns are starting to come out, and I've seen quite a few interesting ones that are being published, but you can use as a baseline the general smoking use studies. So if you assume an e-cigarette user takes 300 puffs a day and a mean puff volume of 55 mils, that then results in a volume of 16.5 litres per day. If you divide the proposed daily intake then, so the 60 micrograms, by the total daily volume, it results in an HC value of 3.6 milligrams per meter cubed as a concentration in each puff. So EL scientists conducted some user studies where we've had a look at how much a vapor might vape per day. And obviously there's very, very different patterns of vaping between those who are using PG heavy liquids versus VG heavy liquids. And we found that on average, a PG heavy liquid user vapes about 1.5 mils a day, and a VG heavy user vapes about 4 mils a day. We can then use those values to calculate HCVs. So in the actual eLiquid itself, which is what we're measuring. So it works out to about 40 ppm for high PG eLiquid and about 15 ppm for high VG eLiquid. So are the diketones blanket banned? Will the competent bodies take limits of detection and limits of quantitation into consideration? Certainly the MHRA won't give a concrete answer written down to me, but they have said verbally that provided you can justify toxicologically the inclusion of diacetyl or acetalpropanol in your product, then that is okay. So that is something. So what do we know? E-liquids contain tens to hundreds of different ingredients, and the dose makes the poison. This is relevant to the amount of the product, or the amount in the product, as well as the amount of the product that is being consumed. And finally, it applies to all ingredients, not just the diketones. So within the last 12 months, EL Science has conducted very detailed and comprehensive testing of over 1,000 samples for TPD submissions to the EU CEG portal. And as mentioned earlier, we've also commissioned over £500,000 worth of toxicological data with Vibram. So we identify the individual ingredients within an e-liquid product. We quantify these, which means we determine how much of those ingredients are actually present, and then we assess these concentrations against established health criteria values to provide a toxicological profile of the overall product. And we found that 24% of all e-liquids tested have contained levels of ingredients above their actual recommended HCV levels. That's a quarter of the products out on the market. I'm going to give you a little bit of a breakdown on some of our findings. So we'll start with an easy one. So several compounds such as 2,3-hexane-dione and 2,3-heptane-dione, which are also diketones, they've been grouped together by expert groups with diacetyl, which is actually 2,3-butane-dione, and acetalpropanol, which is 2,3-pentane-dione. And they've been grouped together because of their toxicological effects. However, they're still not on the banned list anywhere. The Federal Institute for Risk Assessment has actually recommended a total ban for these two chemicals based on the potential to cause severe respiratory inflammation following inhalation. We only actually found about 2% of the e-liquids tested contained these two chemicals. So about 1.5% had the hexane dione, and about 0.5% had the heptane dione. So not a major cause for concern, but really the point is that if you go and speak to an e-liquid manufacturer, they're very unlikely to even know that these two chemicals exist and that they can be ingredients within their products. So if we move on to Guaiacol and Phenol, which are a bit more interesting, they're a starting material for over 85% of the world's vanillin. This leads to their presence within e-liquid products, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Guaiacol is included in SCHEER's priority list of tobacco additives. So SCHEER is the Scientific Committee on Health, Environmental and Emerging Risks. It has use as a local anesthetic, which can enhance smoke inhalation, thus potentially contributing to addictiveness. It can also cause neurological, hemodynamic, respiratory, metabolic, renal, digestive, and hematologic adverse effects. From a cardiopulmonary point of view, it's been reported to be a respiratory tract irritant, while with animal studies resulting in pulmonary edema, and there are conflicting studies, quite interestingly, regarding the genotoxicity. It also has carcinogenic effects, with animal studies reporting the formation of papillomas and carcinomas. And for this reason, the health criteria value that's been calculated is actually quite low. So it's at 0.018% for PG heavy liquids and 0.07% for VG heavy liquids. What we found was that 27% of all e-liquids analyzed contain guaiacol, which is really quite a staggering amount considering the toxicity of the compound. 13% of those, so 13% of the guaiacol positive liquids, were above the recommended health criteria value and therefore required recipe reformulation. Phenol, again, has anesthetic properties. It can destroy nerve endings. As such, the local toxicity it causes can be painless and can possibly lead to less awareness and a high degree of damage. The European Chemicals Agency subjects phenol to harmonized classification as a mutagen. Inhaled phenol causes local toxicity to the respiratory tract, and it's also been linked to effects on heart rate and blood pressure, as well as been a skin and eye irritant. So we found phenol in 9% of all of the e-liquids that we tested. They were generally at low levels, but the recommendation is for phenol not to be included in e-liquids whatsoever. So if we move on to Citral, whereas Guaiacol and Phenol have very low health criteria values or thresholds, Citral is quite the opposite. So it's found in lemon and citrus flavors, particularly ones like the lemon sherbets, which are obviously very popular. It has a relatively high HCV of 0.31% in PG heavy e-liquids and 0.12% in VG heavy ones. And the primary health effect is significant respiratory irritant effects above these levels. So here we found that 28% of all e-liquids tested contain Citral. This in itself is not really a cause for concern. Definitely nowhere near the cause for concern as the previous compounds, Guaiacol and Phenol. Of the Citral positive e-liquids though, 7% were above their HCV levels. And of those, 50% were at least double the health criteria value. So finally, raspberry ketone, which is a great tasting flavor. We've actually got some examples of these flavors outside at our stand. So if you are interested in having a bit of a sniff, I promise there's no long-term exposure with the short sniff, it'll be fine. But you can come and get an idea of what properties they do have. So raspberry ketone is another one that has high HCV thresholds. It's a chemical generally found in fruit, sweet, jammy flavors. It's nowhere near as severe as phenol, but at high concentrations, raspberry ketone can produce similar effects to overexposure to the phenol compounds. And it has a moderate acute oral toxicity that does warrant classification. There's also significant data gaps with respect to this chemical, so we just don't see a lot of information out there on it, particularly taking inhalation effects into consideration. So raspberry ketone has, again, a high HCV threshold of 0.19% in VG heavy liquids and 0.5% in PG heavy liquids. However, 19% of tested eLiquids contained raspberry ketone. 58% of those were above the HCV level. And rather shockingly, 93% were more than double that health criteria value, and 20% were more than triple it. So that's probably my favorite slide. It just gives you an idea of how something that can be considered quite safe at reasonably high levels is actually being used in eLiquid products at levels that are nowhere near what would be considered okay. So I'm going to briefly talk about acetal and ketal formation as well. It's a characteristic reaction of aldehydes and ketones. In eLiquids, this occurs in conjunction with propylene and other glycol carriers. So due to the presence of numerous stereocenters and isomers, several acetals can actually be formed during during steeping. So each of these contribute to the total percentage of the ingredient in the actual eLiquid. If a laboratory is not specifically looking for the acetal or the ketal version of a chemical, they won't see it. And what they'll get is an underrepresentation or a lower measure of how much of that compound is actually present in the product. For TPD, what they asked for was the recipe of the product. So what we did was we obviously took the acetals and the ketals into consideration. We back calculated to get the overall amount of the original chemical that was in the recipe. It's also important, though, in terms of the emissions, because what you can get following inhalation and absorption is the acetal can revert back into the original compound. So it can revert back into the alcohol, which is PG, and an acid, and the aldehyde can be formed transiently before oxidation fully to the acid again. And that can keep happening over and over again as it travels through the body. So HCV is obviously something that really needs to be taken seriously. People need to be thinking about it. I've spoken about 6 compounds here today. We've identified over 340 common eLiquid ingredients that have health criteria values associated with them. eLiquid manufacturers need to be aware of these HCV levels, and they need to be aware when they're manufacturing and conscious when they're manufacturing of trying to keep below these levels to ensure that the end product is safe for consumers. Another thing to consider is that whereas the HCV for diacetyl was 40 ppm, and the HCV for acetopropanol was 40 ppm, and for 2,3-hexanedione was 40 ppm, if you've got all of those chemicals in there, accumulatively, the HCV level is still 40 ppm. It's not 40 plus 40 plus 40. So it's something that really needs to be taken into account. So does this mean the death of the vaping industry? Does it mean that vapers are not going to be able to enjoy flavorful products anymore? No, it doesn't. I'm really proud of that. I did that myself. We've had amazing success with our reformulations. We've reformulated hundreds of different chemicals or different products for people. So what we do with the reformulations is if there is a particular compound that is above the health criteria value, we can either reduce the amount of just that compound in your product. If that has too much of an effect to the overall taste, because some of the chemicals, the reason they're in there at high levels is because they need to be in there at high levels, then we can substitute it for a different chemical that has a different toxicological implication or a lower toxicological implication. So I've recently had a word from one of our customers, the Demon Vapor. We reformulated his lemon lush flavor, and it just won best dessert at the Vapor Expo in Birmingham. So he's delighted about that. We're delighted about that. And it's a good example of how you can still keep flavor in a product whilst being toxicologically aware of what you're putting into it. So in conclusion, we feel very, very strongly that the industry, the consumers, public health, we all need to be more aware of the potential health effects and the toxicological implications of all eLiquid ingredients, not just diacetyl, not just acetylpropanol, and obviously not just formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, and so on that we're looking at in terms of the emissions. The other thing to remember is that even though, as we saw with Citral and with raspberry ketone, even though some of these compounds can have high HCV levels, we're seeing them in the products at even higher levels. So that really, really needs to be thought about. So yes, e-liquids and e-cigarettes are at least 95% safer than traditional tobacco cigarettes, but there's no reason that we can't make them as safe as they possibly can be. So just to conclude, we have a table outside. Like I said, come and have a look. We've got a poster outside as well, which gives a bit more detail on some of our findings. If anyone is interested in collaborations, we are always very open to that. We've got a team full of chemists that are super psyched about trying to get as much research done as possible. We also have a huge amount of toxicological data, and we don't really see the point of just sitting on it. So we are willing to share that with public health bodies. If anyone is interested, please do come speak to me, because we feel that this is something that everyone needs to be aware of. So if anyone have any questions now?